tell our elderly we haven't forgotten about you. My name is Elana, and tonight we have the privilege to talking about our grandparents as well as our parents. We're bringing in an expert, a psychogeriatrician. I asked him earlier, is that even the right term to call you? And he is an expert in working with people who are elderly. So, Doctor, thanks for your time. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thanks very much for having me on.
We promise people reassurance during this time of lockdown and even past COVID-19. I think people are really sad. We need some good news. We need upliftment and we need advice. So let's get started. Being elderly or older is already a challenge. And now with us experiencing COVID-19, it has brought on a lot. What are some of the challenges that our senior citizens are experiencing during this time?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you very much for hosting this and for the passion in bringing care and attention to the space. It's absolutely critical. I think a lot of people will be aware that isolation is an enormous problem, not just for elderly people, but through lockdown, a vast majority of the population, if not the entire population, level 5, got to experience what it's like to be elderly, to be blunt, to be in a nursing home or a retirement village, excuse me, and they experienced what it's like not to socialize, although they were with people, hopefully with family in their spaces. So isolation is an enormous one, being cut off. We know that most elderly people who are widowed or widowers, who are single basically, and who don't have access to family in placements, often don't have any physical contact with any people. There were quite a few studies from America showing that simply not having a skin contact for sometimes months on an end can be really, really hectic. And you know, the skin is the largest sensory organ in the body, and you need physical touch. As humans, we're social creatures. So isolation is an enormous one. The other thing is a lack of access to basic healthcare. So whereas previously an older person may have gone down to the general practitioner, or the general practitioner may have come to the retirement village, there are enormous barriers now to accessing routine healthcare, things such as immunization, things non-corona, common flu. The other thing we've seen, unfortunately, is lack of medication. Entire supply chains throughout the world were disrupted. So typical medications that patients have been on for decades sometimes were not available. And then a substitute would have to be found. And then there was a knock-on effect where people were then anxious or scared or didn't take medication they weren't familiar with. And so the whole health burden increased dramatically, not just with COVID. And we've seen, unfortunately, some really dramatic, severe presentations. And each sort of retirement space has gone through different episodes of lockdown or what we call quarantine. Yeah, so it's been a really upside down space. I think most people know that. For the elderly, being older means less resilience to change. And that's one definition of aging, not being as flexible to external events and internal events in the body, if you like. And so the ultimate external event is a pandemic. Yeah, so it's been really, really stressful, I think, for many, many people. Yeah.
The reason I said bringing knowledge and educating us is because the more we know, and you just said something that's so important, you know, I myself have got elderly parents, and to see them before lockdown and to see what they are like after lockdown is a completely different sight. I spoke to a lady this morning that spoke about how her parents are in Spain. She's stuck in Dubai, and she's too scared to go and visit because she might be taking COVID to them. So there's so many challenges, whether you are living with your mom or your dad or with your grandparents. And there's so many challenges also not being with them, which brings me to this question. What are the challenges that our seniors are facing when they are living on their own, which you have touched on already, because that sounds like a magnitude of problems with COVID on top of that. But also, what challenges do our seniors face when they are living with their children?
Yeah, great question. So we work in acute psychiatric clinics, KSO in Parktown and Alberton, and there are others, where elderly people are admitted out of necessity through severe crises, either self-harm risks, harm to others, or psychosis, seeing unusual things, hearing voices that are not there, being deluded. We've had a lot of cases of the conviction of being COVID positive when there's no evidence for it. So the patient will have COVID negative test, but they're terrified that they are, and then they believe they are. And so most of the reason I raise that, most of these patients have been living with family. And it's interesting, not all elderly folk live in the house. Often there's an outhouse or a cottage or something on the property. But because lockdown has caused, to be blunt, cabin fever, where like this Zoom webinar, not so long ago, we will be doing this in person. Now, houses are not geared for Zoom spaces. I'm speaking to you from my dining room. Doesn't matter how big the house is, you need Wi-Fi, it's stressful. Suddenly the children who are adults are working and they need quiet. They need, to do their work online and whatnot. And there's granny and grandpa, older people, needing to go about their daily routine. And then, of course, the children are not at school. And so you've got grandchildren, often more than one or two, who need to be entertained, who need to be at school. And so you've got an unprecedented time of an entire family system cramped into a small space. And you've got the added burden of not knowing how long you're going to have to do that. If you said to people it's going to be for 6 weeks and then you can all come out again, fair enough. But then we got drip fed, as was good and necessary, I think. So we're in level 1 now, which is a blessing. But jeepers, so for elderly people, we did see some dumping where families had had enough. And so this caregiver burden, where people feel guilt, becomes caregiver burnout. And we had many sons and daughters saying, we just can't take it anymore. We have to admit them to hospital, which is cruel and horrible. We have to place them. And that is tough because now we talk about the rights of older people. Just because you're losing patience with your mother or father or grandmother doesn't mean that their rights are less. So it's very, very hectic, I think. And then there's so many things. One is the hand washing, and washing the food. I realized not everybody washed their food. We thought you had to wash food because this virus was on the food from the shops, but many people just didn't do it. They didn't believe in it. Washing food's tricky. It's difficult. And you're constantly reminded that this little thing you can't see may kill you. Or you, as you said earlier, and I agree with you, you may transmit it. And so the lack of sleep is a big one for everyone in the system. Elderly people sleep less anyway. And then the fear of dying, fear of contaminating others. And then the sort of unfortunately perfect storm is the economic crisis of how are we going to afford this? Because if everyone loses their jobs, where will the food come from? How will we live? And it is hectic that, and then of course, if you're watching social media or rather TV and you're hearing that older people are more vulnerable to the virus, just for a moment, I'm 49 years old. If I was 69, 79, I'd be thinking, oh, hang on, if I get this thing, I might die. Maybe my life's not ready yet. I haven't got my will and I'm actually quite healthy now. So it's been a really, really hectic space. But hopefully the physical part of it is now less of a risk. Unfortunately, we're now in the middle of a mental health surge and mental health crisis. So for every 1% GDP goes down, the suicide rate goes up by 1%. And that means because people can't cope, they don't have funds and stuff. There's a lot to talk about,
Yeah. If you just joined in, we are talking about our parents and our grandparents. Our expert for tonight, Dr. thanks again for joining us, Dr. Ryan Fuller. He is a psychogeriatrician, better known also as an old age psychiatrist. And we're talking all things about our parents, the challenges that COVID has brought on. But tonight we also want to bring upliftment and reassurance. Doctor, I have to commend you on the compassion and the empathy that you have when speaking about the elderly, because these are our folks and our parents. And it's like you're saying that a role of caregiver has changed into something completely different. What can we, and I'm assuming that some of our elderly, they're watching and they're listening tonight, and a warm welcome. Thank you for watching the Zoom tonight. What can we tell them that will give them reassurance? What can we say to them about the position? Because here's the thing, you just mentioned it, mental health. lockdown and COVID has brought to the front a topic that most of us were ignoring for most of our lives. No one wanted to talk about how their head is feeling, how sad or happy they are. And for the first time, out of isolation, lockdown, and COVID, we are willing to talk about our feelings. So what reassurance can we give our senior citizens and our elderly tonight?
Yeah, that's a super question. I wish we had a simple answer in a bottle that we could bottle and give to everyone. I don't know for sure. My message would be that it matters, that they matter, and we need them now more than ever. It's really interesting. One of the privileges of working with older people is hearing more about their life stories through many, many decades. And, you know, South Africa is an interesting country. We've got so many official languages and cultures. And we often don't understand where immigrants came from. For example, in the Jewish community, I wasn't aware that there were different tranches of people who had immigrated from Europe, often under persecution, not just the Second World War, but from the turn of the century as well. And I wasn't aware that there was a policy that Jewish immigrants had to have a skill. And I heard the other day of a chap who had no skill, and he quickly learned how to putty a window. And he conned his way in, basically saying, no, he was an expert at putting in windows. And I said, oh, okay, in you come. And then he built a very successful window factory and went on to do very, and I think our country's made up of immigrants like that from all different backgrounds, not just Europe. We forget about African immigrants, you know. Just quickly, when I was at school, there were no non-white pupils at all. We had 1,200 white boys, and we assumed that, you know, to be blunt, that the ANC were terrorists. And we were going to get killed in our sleep and blah, blah, blah. And we went, yeah. And then I went back and we did a talk on, and a third of the school is now black and half of it is non-white. And so I was talking and I said, you know, we were told that in 1652 when Jan van Riebeeck arrived, there was no one in South Africa. That as he arrived from Holland, basically, he was a white dude. And as he arrived, black people migrated south from Central Africa. And then they met in the middle, had a big fight, and the white man won. And therefore, he had rights to the land. And I can see you smiling at me. And while I was saying this, the school kids, you know, age 13 plus, were rolling in the aisles. They thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever heard in their life. So we said, well, so thank you for coming. We really appreciate you being here. And it was telling because of our cultural differences. And the reason I'm talking about this is we underestimate the value of, in other societies, they're called elders. North American Red Indians, they have elder societies. Right. And these are not primitive tribes, they're just indigenous folk. Aborigines have elders. Mm. We as, and I'm sorry to say this, as European, typically Anglo-Saxon, British people have a shocking legacy of putting older people in care homes. Mm. And it's often actually Indian families and, to be blunt, black families that look after their elderly. If you look at India, most people are not in care homes. They don't have that luxury. They're cared for at home. And in that space, if you go not so far back in human history, it was the narrative history of sitting around a table and talking and explaining where the family comes from and the value of an oral history. And I think in a time of crisis like this, we need fortitude. We need people who've been through crises, through immigration, through wars, to remind us that things like this happen, that it's okay. And even if granny or grandpa can't remember stuff brilliantly, or is a bit frail and can't walk well, or maybe their eyesight's going, they're still a human being. And their legacy of age, being, you know, over 65, 75, 85, even older, has tremendous meaning, especially in this digital age of instant gratification. So I'm hoping that people will actually sit down and appreciate each other a bit more. We've seen that, acts of kindness, actually reaching out to people that we don't normally speak to, because we realize that, hopefully, we realize that this thing called life can be quite brittle and transient. Maybe we're not in as much control as we'd like to believe. Just want to touch on something. I mean, I talk too much, so you must butt in, please.
No, we're really enjoying your talk, and I see that there's some questions coming through, so please continue.
But the one thing, I mean, I'm not Jewish by religion. I'm Christian. You know, I joke and say we're all children of Abraham, so that's okay. But one of the things I did in lockdown was join a Bible study, which I'd never done before. Because it was online, accessible, and there was fellowship. And my own spirituality. I believe very passionately in people, and that, that the connection with a higher being, I'm going to call that God there, I said it, is important. You know, if you bash the Bible in Britain, you call it a God botherer. So I don't want to be a God botherer. But I do believe passionately in some form of spirituality. And one of the values of the Bible study was reminding ourselves in the 10 Commandments of honor thy mother, or honor thy father and thy mother, if you want to live a long life. And what does that mean? And in this particular study, it was saying, well, if an older person doesn't have means to eat, they've run out of money, or they've run out of hope, it's our duty as younger people in the Bible to honor them. You may not have to like your mum and dad or your granny and grandpa, but you do have to honor them in a spiritual sense if you want to live a long life. If you forsake them, part of the message in this group was, then don't cry when good things don't happen to you. And taking that further was the idea that the way we treat older people and animals is a mark of how civilized we are, because we ourselves are going to get older. And so I think it's actually very important for people to connect with the generation that's above us and even beyond us. In Europe, there are quite a few interesting projects, and in Holland and I think in Norway, where university students are given free boarding in retirement village type setups, but in return, they have to spend an hour doing community work with an elder person, whether that's pushing them in a wheelchair, doing their shopping. And what's interesting is then you get that mentoring of an older person's wisdom. And that's the other message I would give of hope. The one thing I do not have because of my age is a person that's been alive on the planet for often, nearly double my time.
Yeah.
They have life experience, and that's valuable. Yeah.
Doctor, what you're saying is so important. And I want to touch on something you said earlier. So one of the discussions that we've had on a Thursday evening in this space was one of our speakers that talked about lepidology and how important touch really is. And Anonymous, I'm going to call you, Anonymous is talking about that feeling of isolation and her people and her parents being extroverts. And it brings me to what you said earlier, how we all are humans and that we crave touch, that we crave a hug and being held. This question says the following: how do I strike the balance between mental health and social distance? My parents are both extroverts. Isolation depresses them. They don't get on too well. So let's assume that she's talking about getting on too well with each other as spouses, but also getting on along with a family, because I know that in my family with the elderly, there is no such thing as social distance, because it is impossible to tell Oma that you can't hug her beautiful grandchildren that she hasn't seen in 7 months. So I've told myself, if I get COVID, it's okay. But that's my approach, because I just really want the hug.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because as far as I understand what you're asking, what the question's asking is how to get the balance right between extrovert older people who want to get out there, and then who did you say that who don't get on with themselves that well? Is that right?
They don't get on with a partner.
Yeah, that's a problem. Well, my first approach would be to say that marriage or partnerships, don't have to be married, living together, is never 100% harmonious. And there will be a lot of more intimate, not physical and emotional times, and then more distant times as life happens. This is one of those intense times. So I would try and put it in a sense of context to say that it's an abnormal time and one needs to do various interventions to try and help people understand each other. If, doing my job, I'd need to know from the risk when they don't get on, I'm assuming it's bickering or that they're a bit nasty to each other in talking, that there's no physical abuse, to be blunt, because that is something with gender-based violence that is rightly on the agenda. The other thing is elder abuse, which can be physical, emotional, financial, or other, God forbid, sexual. And that often is not even on the radar screen. It's just assumed that these things just don't happen, or that, I don't know, there's a lack of agency in many spaces. So I'd want to know that it's just marital bickering and not an abusive situation, because if it's an abusive situation, then I think it's the family's duty to intervene in a kind way, the least restrictive way, and try and bring some oxygen to the system. But let's assume it's bickering, and let's assume that they're stressing each other out. One of the things is to try and be creative, I think, and to find some sort of physical distancing that still plays by the rules, so to speak. So one of the things, for example, was knowing that going to a park, open air, is less dangerous than a closed room. For many months of the lockdown, we didn't know that really. We just thought that this bug was a nightmare and that we'd get it wherever we went. Now we know that going for a walk in a park, wearing a mask, is actually reasonably safe if there's enough air to dissipate things and you're not unwell, obviously, and you're sensible. And so I would say to change the environment, they need to get out of the environment and try and be with a third party. And so it's possible then to walk with people and have a sense of social camaraderie, but not necessarily sit down and have dinner parties. I don't know how sociable they are. But it sounds to me like the person asking the question is a bit freaked out or a bit stressed by how their parents conduct themselves. I know in my own family, my father was a nightmare. He said, this thing doesn't exist. I'm 70 odd years old. I've lived my life. I don't care. I'm just going.
Oh, sounds familiar.
And we literally took him with his ear to have his immunization done. And he was a bit like a child. And we had to take control. And I said, stop it now. You're going to get arrested. Stop it. And also, he didn't think anything of coming to visit us, jumping in his car. And we said, hey, stay away. We love you, but stay away. Yeah. But what we then did was we said, look, for birthdays, special dates, we'll see you. Well, let's make a plan. And then we did this. We Zoomed. We proactively phoned them. And we tried to stay in touch. Then we delivered things as well. So we'd go around and deliver a meal, or just to let them know that we're thinking of them. That helped a lot. I don't know if that helps the person asking the question.
I think it does, because part of the question also talks about mental health, and I want to get to that. Now, when we started out, and I see that a few more people have joined, we said today is also about upliftment, and it's about understanding. And before we can show empathy, I think there has to be a matter of understanding. So we're helping each other understand our parents and our grandparents. What if there is a situation, in the way her question started, where mental health is something that, let alone understanding it oneself, you now need to understand in your parents and grandparents? And I'm thinking of things like early onset of dementia, things like forgetfulness, things like they regress or ask you things over and over. And because we're in this interesting time where we're feeling tired, exhausted, depleted, we feel like we've been robbed from 7 months of our lives, we've changed and we're less patient. What advice can you give us in understanding mental health? I mean, we've discussed it at length in this space about ourselves, but especially when it comes to other people and the elderly.
Yeah, again, that's a great question. So if I'm understanding you correctly, you're asking what advice we can give to elderly people or their families, or both?
To our families. I think when it comes to our elderly people, and I'm speaking out of turn because I'm not a doctor, I'm just a child of a person who is also old, and I have many old friends, and I can see how they are regressing and how time is moving fast and how they are moving slower. And I don't think we can change them. I think if there's any change that can happen, it's going to be within us, because we are more resilient. And we are like elastic bands. We can still stretch after COVID and do our thing, A part of me thinks we should let them be. So I'm asking, how do we better understand mental health and equip ourselves so that we can understand our parents better?
Sure. So I think what I'm thinking, part of the answer is to say, well, what is mental wellness, mental health in the elderly look like? And what are some of the challenges? So we know that depression is an enormous problem. Anyway, before COVID, we know that insomnia, not sleeping through the night and worrying about stuff, is a normal part of aging. People sleep less. But if there's a change in that pattern and there's no sleep at all, that's unhealthy. And then the patients are tired, people during the day are struggling, and then they might fall. And then there's a sort of a chain reaction of other mental health problems that lead to physical health problems. So I think part of it is understanding what's common and what they might be suffering. I think one of the strategies that we try and do at memory care, for example, is to say, as soon as we think we know what's going on, we need a holiday. Because we never, ever know what's really, really going on. How can we? We spend a very short time with a human being and we try our best to understand what they're going through. We try empathize, is a great word. So another good word, which is a similar meaning, is resonance. You know, two different bodies vibrating at the same frequency might find some harmony. And so we should try really hard not make assumptions. And if we do make an educated guess why mum or dad isn't having a great time or we're a bit worried about them, we need to test our assumptions and ask them questions. And so what we try and do clinically, you know, and this is, I think, what might help day to day, is to create a safe space. And that safe space should be a space where people can be honest, where they don't feel judged. Often there are elephants in the room. A common one is son or daughter might get a job offer, if they're lucky, to emigrate or to move away from a city like Joburg to a nicer place like the coast. And one of the fears might be then of not seeing their children. And the children feel guilty, so it's not spoken about. And there's this unspoken dread, if you like, that's always in the room, sort of hanging in the mist. And if things like that are not addressed, that leads to mental health problems, anxiety, and physical health problems. And then sometimes you get overreaction with guilt, where an elderly person gets sick to hold the whole family hostage because you can't go away now because gran or mum and dad is in the hospital. Of course, they won't say that. And so there are dynamics in every family system. I just want to say the one thing that I find helpful is Freud, I think, might have been Erickson, you know, the foremost psychiatrist and psychologist, said people go through different phases in life. You know, Shakespeare's 7 Ages of Man. And when a person gets to an elderly phase, there's this drive between dignity and despair. Right. And very, very few humans find dignity. And it's not got to do with money or outward success. It's got to do with the inner self fulfillment of one's life. And we assume, the hypothesis is that most people have a degree of despair at not being with their family. And so we test that and say, well, how can we be with a person? We don't have to be with them physically necessarily, but if you think about what you would want, if you were quite elderly, depending on the situation, you'd want to know that you're being held in mind, that you're still loved and that it's still okay, basically. So that empathy is about creating a safe space. The simple techniques, well, simple, I mean, we try to say, I mean, I spend my life playing like a fool to make people try and laugh at me. You know, I always say I'm fighting anorexia and I'm winning, you know, and if you don't behave yourself, I'll sit on you. And they look at you as if you're a bit odd. Because one of the fears is that if you can't move as quick and you're not thinking as fast as you used to, you might be a bit frail. I know I'm less resilient. And I know that if I upset you, you might not come and see me again. So I'm not going to be honest with you. I'm going to try and do my very best to make sure that I don't upset you. But that's not really what you're looking for. You're looking for me to be honest, to tell you I'm terrified, that I'm not sleeping at night, etc. So what we do is we create, I guess, a small problem. And we say, gosh, you know, mum, dad, granny, grandpa, you'll never believe it. I don't know what to do in this situation, even if you do know what to do. And you're looking for advice. You're trying to validate and have some meaning. And you might frame it where you know that they were particularly good at a certain skill. A silly example, if my son can't kick a soccer ball and my grandfather used to be a footballer, jeepers, you know, I tried to teach him and it didn't work. And maybe I'll help. Oh, really? Okay, that's great. And it's that whole thing of if I tell you to do something and I put my finger at you, you're not going to want to do it out of pride and ego. But if I suggest, I invite, I am with you, but I let you speak, it's hard to listen and hear sometimes because like we're doing now, you know, we have to survive. But for an older person, they're not used to, they don't have to do this. They're not working often. And what's really hard, and I know what I try and do, is just to be quiet, to not talk, but not to sulk, not to make it uncomfortable. So there's lots of nodding and smiling and
listen.
just listening. And that's why I say going back to the old school values of going for a walk, probably the most effective thing in the universe, just going for a stroll, looking at the world around. And yeah, that's interesting. Okay. It's difficult. Sorry, the last one is grandchildren are brilliant change agents.
Yes.
Assuming they're well behaved enough and they don't get thrown.
Even if they're not.
And that's, you know, that's a blessing always, well, usually, because there's living proof of a legacy of the value of meaning. Existential angst is another major theme of, unfortunately, getting older, that existential part of questioning one's existence. So we're the only animals that really, if you think about it, stop and go, why am I here? Where am I going? Yeah. Where did I come from? What happens when I die? That's a normal human experience at some point. And it's terrifying for most humans to have to think that maybe it doesn't matter, that 7 billion people, who's going to miss you, you know? And then you have to confront your own mortality, and that causes anxiety. There's the angst. But that existential angst can become debilitating, paralyzing, lead to panic attacks, to a belief that I don't matter, especially if no one's coming to see me, especially if no one's giving me time to connect. Mm. The other point is about seeing and hearing. I assume you can hear me. I assume you can see me because you're youthful. That has to be tested. In elderly people, often they can't hear properly. Now we're talking and rabbiting away, and they're just looking at you. They don't really follow. They're catching every fourth word or whatever. And then you say, oh, they're a bit dumb or they're confused. No, you're just talking too quickly. Slow down. Don't dumb it down. And so we use quite a lot of gestures, actually, for people in the clinic who sort of arrive and you talk about empathy. Go, hello, how are you? And they look at you and think, that's a bit odd. So it's about understanding. So I'm not a small human, and I spend a lot of time trying to make myself smaller, because if I make myself big, I'm going to be threatening. If you are quite little, then you might want to be able to connect in a certain way. The other thing is, in your families and other people's families, you have different personas and personalities. So you'll know that type of guy was quite strict, he's old school, he doesn't like being told what to do, quite stubborn, difficult. Or you'll have a neurotic, anxious person that just needs a bit of time. My grandmother, if you put something in the palm of her hand, my late grandmother, she would squeeze it. So we'd we played a nasty trick, we'd put a marshmallow in her hand, and she would go, you bloody man, and she'd squeeze this thing, because she just didn't like the feeling of it. And because she was quite nervous and neurotic, unfortunately. And so we would spend a lot of time just playing with her and being with her. But there are many elderly people who are tough as nails. So, I mean, I can talk for a long time about this, the empathy. A lot of it is humor. I think that for me is key. Yeah.
Well, you surely bring a whole different side to this conversation. And I see a few of you have just joined. Thank you. Our parents and our grandparents, that was we talking about. And Doctor was just unpacking empathy and how we can approach and chat and make our parents and grandparents laugh. And I think a big thing for me as well is patience, just the mere fact of slowing down and speaking slower. Doctor, before you go, and this has been insightful and beautiful, and we've had reassurance, someone's watching tonight and they are torn. They are torn between having parents with them, they're suffering mentally, they're struggling with patience, they're struggling with this feeling of empathy. And on the other side, they're thinking perhaps it's better for them to be in an institution, in a home, in a hospital, in a place where they can be taken care of. How do you know you're making the right or the wrong decision for you?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. I think the first thing I'd say is buy time. So if it's not a crisis and you don't have to make the decision, then don't make it. There's often far more time than we realize. Kennedy, great American president, the Cuban Missile Crisis, apparently that was his gift. He knew he had time to get more information. In a similar way, it's a high stakes decision that you could regret for the rest of your life. So seek professional help. And that's through the Chabad, through many different organizations, SADC, for example.
Yes.
There are counselors, there are social workers who can guide you. A lot of our work is giving people permission to make a decision they've already made. Every family is different, every family. Depends on the resources available and the structure of the family. It might be in the best interest of the person not to be placed in a place. And there's a lot of help available. Caregiver burden, burnout, often a safe space for the son or the grandparent and the grandchild to talk, whether that's speaking by telephone or like this, Zoom. I know there are many free resources. The Psychiatry Association, SASOP, as well as SADC and others, and Lifeline and helplines, can often just give you a sense of perspective. So I would just simply say, don't make any rash decisions. Yeah.
For patience, empathy, and definitely understanding, if we still figure ourselves out after lockdown and this interesting time that we've been through, I think we should be even more patient with our parents and our grandparents. Dr. Ryan Fuller, old age psychiatrist and psychogeriatrician, it has been an honor speaking to you. Unfortunately, we have run out of time tonight. Thank you for your questions as well as your comments, and a big thank you to the Citizen as well as to Chabad South Africa. This recording will be live on YouTube as well as on our Facebook pages, so you can follow us right now, Chabad South Africa. We look forward to hearing and seeing you. Doctor, this was insightful. I am inspired. I'm inspired. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it so much.
Thanks for having me. Good discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. Incredible. Have a wonderful evening and the rest of the week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.